Yeah, I just want it up and running so the students will be able to find me and know that it's running. I've scheduled it to actually begin at 11, but I just want the signal actually up and working. Okay. Partly just because I need to clear all the decks. Like I need to have my slideshow going. I had to update the, what do I call this, the banner. So it's March 18th, so they'll see that. Yeah. So this is the added stuff that I can do because I'm not using Zoom, is that I can composite multiple things on here. So this is the streaming software program, the piece of software that I'm using, and it has my webcam, it has a slideshow running pictures from a directory that I have, and it has a still image over here which has the SF State logo, and it has the date, and it has the topic of the video. So I don't know that you can do that in Zoom, but I'll study that next. So, okay. So this is the kind of thing that I've seen. Hey, love. This is the kind of thing that I've seen on live stream, and I thought, wow, there's a lot of capabilities there. So that's why I kind of dove in on that. But it's also because I didn't realize that with Zoom, you can actually manage the meeting more than you can in Skype. And like, oh shit, if I had known that, I might have taken the easier path. But anyway, so this is YouTube live stream. So, and I think it is recording on YouTube. That's what I'm certainly hoping, because each of the previous videos, you can get them on YouTube. And that one isn't just this. If you look, this is the web browser, and this is the YouTube here. But I think it's going to include the video as well as the stream.
Okay.
So people's comments will be recorded there.
Okay. I think when I've looked back at live streams of Parts of America folks, like they live stream the debates, which has never worked for me in real time, because it's really out of focus, very fuzzy, and I can't hear anything, so I don't know what what that issue is. Nobody else seems to have that problem, but all the comments run alongside
the live stream.
Yeah.
So that part works. The problem is they haven't got their camera to work.
But nobody else is complaining about that, so it makes me feel like in some way I haven't achieved proper access. And I didn't see any troubleshooting, contact us if you're having problems things. So.
Okay. Oh, I can pop out the chat. Oh my gosh, that's helpful. Nothing to see here. We popped out. Yeah. Dang. Now that means, I think, what that means is I can bring you forward and this one forward. Oh, I can't do it. Why? Okay. So, yeah, I think I'm gonna just have a look. All right, that's grinding against there. This up, grind. What?
Reading a book about the history of glue manufacturing, and I simply can't put it down. Hashtag dad joke day.
Thank you. Is Gabriel still in the shower?
No, Sophie just got into the shower.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We'll probably be tiptoeing out while you're doing class.
Let's see. One more minute until we start class. Beatrice. Hey, Carlos. Hi, Marigel. All right. So, welcome to class, everyone. If you could all sound off, that'd be great. I'll sort of use that as my, well, I will use that as my attendance sign-in. So I hope it's been easy for everybody to find this stream, and those of you who are logging in for the first time to the live stream, welcome to you. I'm hoping you could review the previous videos, because I'm going to leave them up on YouTube. And yeah, let's see. So before we get to discussing chapter 14, one of the things I wanted to follow up on was something that I saw you guys talking about in the text discussion, which was whether you wanted to learn GIS. One of the things we're all finding is we have a lot more time on our hands now that we're stuck at home, and it might be a time to do some more professional skills development. I have taught the USP 492 class 2014, I think it was. I taught it. So I've taught GIS in a kind of quick and dirty way. I'm not the expert on using GIS as some people in the geography department are. I think Aisha Pamuk might use GIS more than I do, but I use it more as a regular tool. I certainly built a geospatial model of Kabul for my dissertation, so I've been using it on a regular basis for, gosh, almost 20 years now, 15 years of regular use. But I use it kind of like people use a word processor. So it's not that I know every single weird thing you can do with a word processor, but I'm a very regular user of the software. So if you want to do that, I think it doesn't fit with the curriculum of the land use course per se, but we could do it maybe as an extra lecture. So sound off in the text to state your opinions about that. If we do so, I am going to use QGIS. So the interface I will teach is QGIS. It's not identical to ArcMap. It's not identical to Esri's ArcGIS. But it's kind of like if you were going to be using ArcGIS, and that's like a Maserati or a Ferrari, I'm going to teach you how to drive a Toyota. It's still driving, still gets the job done for the vast majority of things. Certainly, I've never encountered a circumstance where I needed ArcMap, where QGIS doesn't do what I need to do. It has a tremendous amount of processing capability. But it's also that just to understand the core concepts of GIS, for those of you who haven't used it before, it's a pretty different approach to software, and to some degree you need to understand data theory in a general sense. So that's one reason why I really like SF State's approach of combining an introduction to GIS with an introduction to quantitative methods in the USP 492 course, because it's helpful to understand the data that you're about to process through in a spatial way, but to then understand the nature of data itself. That said, I haven't put it up in my slideshow, but I'm actually very happy with that. The two Gaussian distributions that we've seen circulated all around the country, with the dashed line showing how if we have a COVID infection rate that's low enough, then when it peaks, it will not overwhelm the hospital services and everybody can get treatment. But if everybody gets infected very, very rapidly, you have a much higher distribution, which will overwhelm hospital services. I guess there's a few things I'd want to say about that next. So we should just know about that, whether we do GIS or not. It's called a Gaussian distribution rather than a bell curve because it was a guy named Gauss who figured it out, and he figured it out for astronomy. And if you want to look it up, you can look on Wikipedia. That's got a decent entry for explaining what that means. The main point about a Gaussian distribution is that it's a probability distribution of 100% of a data set. So let's suppose, because colds are fairly infectious, that COVID-19 infects 200 million people. So it can infect 200 million people over a 6-week period, in which case it's going to overwhelm our hospitals, or it can infect 200 million people over a 3-month period, in which case it will not overwhelm our hospitals. If you look at those curves that have been circulating on Facebook and various internet sites, those curves then, what they show is how many people are infected at a given period of time. That's the sort of moving across the x-axis. But then if you take the area under that curve, the area is representing the entire group of 200 million people who will get infected. So the probability has to do with, a few of those people are infected early, few will be infected late, most will be infected in the middle. The probability distribution includes the whole set of 200 million in that population. And the difference is it a sharply peaked curve or is it a broad hump curve? I'm not sure they did it right in that popular graphic, but both of those probability distributions should have actually the same area underneath them. In order to derive the area underneath the curve, you'd have to learn differential calculus. I don't want to. I just look up tables to see what the distributions are around a central peak. I learned differential, but not so good at it. In any case, that's a critical piece to think about for data analysis generally, that if you are trying to gather any sort of information, if you do it through surveys, you're going to have people clustering around the middle of whatever that data sort of centroid is, and then you'll have things that sort of distribute out towards the edges and become sort of rarer conditions as you get out towards the edges. But that's a probability distribution curve of whatever it is you're measuring. Yeah, so this was, I think, a useful, responsible use of it. Hopefully it was illustrative. But I think a lot of times when people see those curves, they're not aware that what it means is a probability distribution of 100% of whatever that population is. All right, so I'm looking at the text coming in. I use ArcGIS, but love to. All right, so okay. Also interested in supplementing GIS. Okay, so here's what I propose. Unless my wife vetoes this. Hey, Lizzie, can I do a session on Friday? We're not going anywhere, are we? Yeah.
We have no plans.
We have no plans? All right. So Friday at 11, I'll do a session on ArcGIS. When I do so, the other thing I'm going to be testing out is that I will be moving up the stream to 720p resolution, which is your basic HD. It's not your full HD. It's more like a DVD rather than like Bluetooth. But it's high enough resolution that I can have a screencast over on the left side where I'm showing slides now, and it'll be a screencast of GIS running so you can see the controls. And I'll just, to begin with, I'll run you through the controls. The reason I'll do that is for those of you who've used ArcMap before, the main difference between QGIS and ArcGIS is where the buttons are. That's really, the most important thing. Conceptually, there's no difference. There's a couple of terms which are used slightly differently, but not many of those either. There's a pretty strong consensus on that. So for those of you that are that have used ArcMap before, this is just trying to figure out how you use the open source software. It's otherwise pretty equivalent. But what I will do is start from scratch. So for those of you who are completely unfamiliar with what a GIS means, what a geographic information system is, I would want to start from scratch. Part of the reason I'd want to do that is that once you get enough of the concept under your belt, you can then fan out over the internet and find all sorts of things on YouTube and technical posts that will help you with much more technical problems in GIS. I find really the problem is that right at the beginning, the learning curve is really steep. So yes, Chris, in answer to your question, QGIS is free. It's free and open source. One big advantage of it is that it comes with all of the plugins available to you immediately. So if you want to do some advanced processing like network analysis, you don't have to pay an additional licensing fee the way you have to do with ArcMap. So having all of that geospatial processing accessible to you right away is very, very handy. The other thing that's really advantageous with QGIS is that it does run on Mac, and it does run on Linux as well. That's how I run it. But it runs on Windows, of course. So it runs on any common PC platform. They've been testing out a version of QGIS to run on Android, so you could run it on a smartphone, but there's a real limitation there because the smartphone just has, you know, your thumb keyboard and it doesn't have a separate mouse. So it's hard to design an interface that can work with such a limited set of options for interacting with it. With PCs and with laptops, you know, by default, you have a separate mouse, you've got a separate keyboard, so you have many, many more interfaces that make it easier for the software to work. Okay, so we'll do that at 11 o'clock on Friday. All right. So without further ado, let's look at this Fulton and Shigley chapter 14. And these sort of weird deliberations about how you do economic development in a state that has the sort of peculiar conditions of California. So part of what Fulton and Shigley start with is that we've been blessed with massive amounts of economic growth that started for various different reasons unrelated to planning. In the middle of the 20th century, I mean, even one could start with the gold rush and then the agricultural rush in the 1870s, but certainly in the 20th century, a huge, huge, huge amount of economic growth. Quite a bit of it was federal spending because a lot of defense industries and technology were developed in California. So in Southern California, it was Northrop and Grumman and Lockheed and Raytheon. So a lot of military contractors, some of which still exist in Southern California. There was a little bit of that here in the Bay Area. We had a lot of naval bases here, Alameda, originally Treasure Island. Actually, no, originally where the San Francisco airport is, and then later Treasure Island. Moffett Field, we had the NASA Ames Center there as well. And for those reasons, we had Fairchild semiconductor industry here pretty early on, and the federal spending for those defense contracts was the economic base that began what we now know as Silicon Valley. Oh, so Chris was asking how the rest of the semester will pan out. Let me interrupt and answer that question right now. So I can use Zoom for office hours. I think it's going to make sense for you to maybe email in and check with me about when you would want to have office hours. Nobody checked in with me on Skype on Monday. And so I have actually signed up for a commercial account for Zoom, so I can set up a session that's running that you can just tap into. Let me see. What else? In terms of turning in your work, I've never asked for hard copy, so you just turn in your soft copy on iLearn. There's no change to that whatsoever. In terms of presentations towards the end of the semester, I would still like students to do presentations, but for those of you that sign up for doing presentations, sound off for me either in the chat now or via email to let me know whether you still want to do presentations, because we're going to have to figure out how to make that work. You can do YouTube live streaming as well. You can do it directly through the browser. I found that wouldn't work for the whole display that you see here, where I've got a sort of topic title below and I've got a slideshow. Oh, sorry, I'm dyslexic that way. All of that requires setting up OBS, which is an client-side streaming software on my computer. I'm using it because it's choking down the stream of data that's going into YouTube, and I need to do that so that my audio signal doesn't hang up because I have such a poor internet connection right now. Okay, so we'll need to make sure each of you can figure out how you can do presentation. We may do that by Zoom on the SF State system, or we may do that via YouTube. So we'll try to work that out. But all of the rest of it, I think, is going to be pretty straightforward. We want to have a substantial change from what we're doing right now. I think because I can composite together a bunch of stuff here on YouTube live stream, I'm going to continue with that. I mentioned in the email that I sent out yesterday, though, that I learned this one really important fact about Zoom, that whoever's the host of a Zoom meeting could mute everybody if there was a huge amount of crosstalk. That's not the same as Skype. I didn't know that. So when we were discussing this in class on the 9th, and I said, I think I'm going to try to use YouTube. The reason I went in this direction was because I didn't know that key piece of information about Zoom. So now I know. It might have been easier, but I've kind of gone this direction, so there's a sort of a sunk cost commitment that I have to this particular format. Besides which, some students have had some difficulty accessing iLearn, and if you can get on the internet at all, you can access this lecture. So why not just keep going with this? Okay. Yeah. Chris, you were asking about whether... So we're not meeting for classes, but are they are you interpreting suspending all classes for the rest of the semester as the same as canceling, as if there will be no grades turned in? I don't think so. I think we're going to complete this course and you're going to get your grades. So I'm not so sure that that's true for Berkeley Public Schools, but I will check that through my notifications. I have not gotten any notification as a lecturer that I'm going to stop delivering my course. That's what canceling would mean. Canceling in-class face-to-face meetings, yes. Yeah, no in-class meetings anymore, but that's not the same as fully canceled. So y'all can check on that. Right, so Jeff still wants to do presentation, Mary still wants to do, Chris wants to do, Paige wants to do. Yeah, so as long as you all have your Zoom accounts, or I guess you may not even need to create a private one because you might just be able to use SF State's on-campus Zoom. As you know, I haven't gone down that whole rabbit hole of figuring out all that technology yet, although I'm beginning to. Yeah, Chris, correct. Yeah, it's canceled in class, but we are continuing. Yeah, which means you get your grade, and for those of you that are about to graduate, you will proceed on to whatever the rest of your life is. So yay. Hopefully by the time the semester ends, our quarantining will probably end, and for better or for worse, because that's kind of the pace of infection of colds. And even though we're doing quarantine, which will slow down the spread of this coronavirus, we're not going to stop it. Probably the same number of people ultimately will be infected who's would have been infected in the first place. We're at least a year away from getting a vaccine, so that's all going to go through. All right. Right. So Nina also wants to do presentation. Yeah. So Thomas, you want to do essay? Okay, that's fine. I'm easy either way. But since enough people want to do presentations, I think that's going to be a good reason for me to learn how the SF State on-campus system works for Zoom, so we can make that easier for all of you. Because I might be willing to learn this streaming technology for me to do YouTube live stream, but it's kind of a hassle. And so I don't want to impose that on all of you. I'd rather that you all be free to use Zoom. It's an easier technology for sure. Okay. So back to economic development. So California has been blessed with very, very strong economic development, and that means that you haven't had cities try to attract firms to them If you study planning in most parts of the country, that's a big part of the story. So just to give you some perspective on this, um, Michigan was very lucky in that all of the automakers first concentrated in Detroit. And so you had massive economic growth of Detroit because it was on the Great Lakes. It had this advantage of heavy shipping, so you could get iron ore and coal into that area. Once you've made the cars, you could physically ship them out. Detroit also had good rail connections, so you could put cars onto railroad cars and send them to Los Angeles or to New York. And it had good road connections, and those just continued to improve through the 1950s and 1960s. So Detroit had a locational advantage at that point, but it went away in the middle of the 20th century because increasingly people could build cars anywhere. And two things happened then in the 1980s. One was that Americans were very negative about allowing Japanese imports because a lot of Americans still thought of Japanese as our enemies during World War II. And other Americans just assumed that American products have higher quality. However, for those of you who know the history of the Toyota Corolla, that's just not the case. The quality control on the Toyota Corolla was incredible. It was a cheap car. It was inexpensive to repair when you needed to repair it, but they just didn't break down very often. Incredibly reliable cars. And they built the quality control reputation of Toyota. However, the U.S. put in import restrictions on Japanese cars. So the workaround for Japanese companies was to say, fine, we'll build our factories inside the United States, and we'll build the same car, but we'll build it inside the U.S. And so they started looking for places to build the cars, and by that point, a bunch of southern states said, please set up your factory here. And those southern states were near the huge hydroelectric dams on the Tennessee River that had been built in the 30s during the Tennessee Valley Project. And so they had plenty of electricity available, and they were anti-union states. And so they wanted to prevent unions from forming. And so they said, you could build Toyotas here, and you can pay your workers less. And so Toyota, Subaru, Honda, they located to places like northern Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky. And so suddenly a lot of auto manufacturing was expanding, but not in Detroit. And so, and even the big three automakers, the U.S. automakers, started then closing factories in Detroit and either opening them in cheaper areas like GM when they set up Saturn. I believe they set it up in Tennessee. And then also setting them up in other countries. So there's a lot of industries which didn't offshore, but the automakers, you could say they did because they didn't just change their production structure. They're still building cars. Now they assemble them in Mexico. Still building cars. But what it meant was that Detroit began its massive economic slide because it was unionized, but unions didn't become nationwide. They were local to that area, and other states didn't have to allow them. And so labor was cheaper in those other states. You get a bit of the race to the bottom. I mean, how different is it having them assembled in Alabama than having them assembled in northern Mexico? It's U.S. citizens. Okay, so that's good, but being paid much less, not so good. But it also meant that it began a process of city-to-city competition inside the United States to attract businesses. And so for planners, that's a lot of what we look at if we're doing planning in other places like Ohio or Colorado or New Mexico or pretty much any place that's not California, and maybe New York. Although upstate New York has suffered from Rust Belt industrial loss. But here, we haven't had to focus so much on that part of business attraction strategy. So the other peculiar component of economic development in California is that we had Prop 13 implemented. We discussed Prop 13 in detail a couple weeks ago. But what it means is that local jurisdictions couldn't get a lot of tax revenue from property tax. And so the main tax revenue is what? You guys sound off. You tell me. What do we get our tax revenue from now here in California? Locally and statewide, where do we get our tax revenue from? I will wait. And we will watch the slides while I wait. Oh, and if you get tired of these slides, I could maybe shift to other slides too. We can talk about them and go to others. Huh. Let's see. What else do I have? Pictures. Photos. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, all right, so I got that one. All right, let's see. All right, here we go. Yes, sales tax. Thank you, Kaya. Let's see. Property tax and sales tax. Yeah, there is still some property tax, but you know, it's been slowly declining as people that hang on to properties and the assessment falls behind the actual value. So we're no longer even seeing a 1% revenue. Exactions, exactly. So we talked about exactions before. The flaw of exactions is that they're upfront fees, and they help if your community has a bunch of new development going in, but once it's already there, then you have to cover operating expenses. And unfortunately, that gets to another part of this chapter, which is why communities have started to fiscalize their land use planning, meaning that let's say that you build a Walmart or a Target. Okay, you're not only going to get some property tax revenue from a new property acquisition, if that company buys that property, which they usually don't, but they might, but you're going to get ongoing sales tax revenue from them. Whereas if you allow a residential development, you'll get all the impact fees from that residential development for covering new infrastructure, but then for the next umpteen number of decades, you're going to be covering costs for healthcare, for schools, for all of those residential services, which are quite expensive, and those operating costs over time, you know, whatever that first impact fee was, it's not going to cover them forever, and they're no longer being covered really by property tax revenue. So unfortunately, it means that housing becomes a bit of a millstone. It becomes a revenue disadvantage because the costs exceed the revenue. So that's one reason why Emeryville was able to do all sorts of redevelopment and new development in the 1990s and the aughties because their residential population was always quite small. Instead, what they have is a big industrial district, and a bunch of those factories went out of business, and so they then could redevelop those as shopping centers or bring in Pixar and various other things. So they were able to do a lot with having business taxes. Some places can also collect payroll tax. San Francisco collects payroll tax. Okay, and Chris is pointing out income tax. Now, income tax, most income tax is collected by the Internal Revenue Service at the federal level. So that goes to DC, and it funds federal programs like Social Security and, although that's supposed to be a separate one. That's out of the scope of this course. We won't talk about that particularly. But say Department of Defense and other federal departments, these are funded by income tax. But the state also collects income tax, and the fraction of income tax collected by the state of California has been increasing. So actually income tax, personal income tax at the state level for California is higher than many other states. And part of that is to compensate for having very low property tax relative to high costs of everything else in California. What that also means is that since income tax comes to the state level, but a lot of the costs are at the local level, we have a whole process of financial transfers between different levels of jurisdiction in California. And I haven't looked at it comparatively, I haven't read documentation on it comparatively, but my sense is that the interagency transfers from state to county and to local jurisdictions in California seems to be much more than in other states. One reason why is that when property tax got eviscerated by Prop 13, the state became involved in doing transfers to local jurisdictions to cover education, and that was new. Also, the state transfers money to counties to cover healthcare because public health agencies are generally operated at the county level. San Francisco has a public health department, but that's because it's a county. The only jurisdiction in California that has a public health department, but it's not a county, is the city of Berkeley. So if you noticed in the shelter-in-place announcement on Monday, they said Marin, San Francisco, San Mateo, Santa Clara, Alameda, and Contra Costa counties, and the city of Berkeley, departments of public health have all declared a shelter-in-place. And that's the reason for that little weirdness. I think the city of Berkeley was debating about what kind of authorities it would have in place, and so back when health departments were forming in the early 20th century, they decided to form their own. Berkeley was also trying to become the state capital, so they actually set aside a lot of the hillside development to try to relocate the capital. So if you ever go to North Berkeley, you'll notice that all of the streets have county names. So they actually named all the streets in North Berkeley after counties in the state of California. It's a weird bit of local history. But anyway, one of the unfortunate things that also means is that Berkeley is a local jurisdiction. It's not a county. It doesn't get county sales tax, but it has to cover the significant costs of running its own health department. And because of the 60s, Berkeley has always had a lot of homeless people, so it's always had quite a heavy burden, quite an expensive health department for a jurisdiction that doesn't have the authority of a county to impose sales taxes the same way counties do. So, a little bit of weirdness there. Okay. So, taxes. If you think about the different sorts of taxes that come in, property tax, income tax, and sales tax are very different animals. And we talked about that a little bit in previous lectures, but let's get a bit more into detail on that now. So, what is a progressive tax and what is a regressive tax? You guys sound off. What is the difference between what people regard as a progressive tax and what people regard as a regressive tax? I think those were mentioned briefly earlier in the book, but if not, if you've heard about it from other classes, just think about what that means, because it's going to matter as we think about the policy implications of different sorts of taxes and land use. So I'll wait for the delay to go through. I suppose, meanwhile, I could talk about these slides. So here we are. This is City of Berkeley. The last slides were from San Francisco. There's a bay window. Yep, even in Berkeley they had bay windows. So in 19th century architecture, even though Berkeley is lower density, it's kind of suburban, it was still an architectural style people liked, so you'll see bay windows even in other cities where they're not hanging out over the public property. Backenheimer Building, 2004, that was the beginning of what I'd consider decent mixed-use urban architecture coming back to California after a 50-year gap. Oh, there's a step back and you can see Omega Salvage. It does have that bay window. It is actually overhanging the corner. In that case, it makes a very nice little corner detail. Yeah, it's a nice building. it's a kind of good urban building, even though it's along San Pablo Avenue, where the other buildings are pretty low density. So the slide that you see now, this has to do with property boundaries and the restriction of people going onto them. So it's a privately owned space where the private owner is allowing public access, just like any retail store. So those terms apply to any sort of retail store as well. But it's worth noting, the University of California has those because it's a semi-private agency, whereas SF State does not. SF State campus is public the way that sidewalks are public. It's truly a public space, whereas the UC Berkeley campus is not quite that. Yeah. All right, so now let me look. People are starting to say. So Beatrice, progressive tax is a tax in which the tax rate increases as the taxable amount increases. Right. Oh, and then she ran out of her 200 characters. Right. Progressive tax, Thomas says, that scales to income level or other economic indicator. Right. Mignon points out a regressive tax, on the other hand, is one where the rate increases as the payer's income decreases. So that can happen, but there's another quality to regressive tax that I'd like somebody to sound off and maybe give an example. So Carlos, a progressive tax increases as at the rate as well as the taxable amount, and vice versa for the negative. That's correct. Okay. So we've got a sense of what a progressive tax scale is. Regressive tax might not be intuitively obvious because it's often called by a different name by people who want to do tax cuts. Yeah, so what is a regressive tax? Right, regressive tax not based on personal income, therefore making people with higher incomes pay a smaller percentage of their income because tax is not based on the ability to pay. That's correct. Thank you, Ivana. Yes. So, for example, sales tax is a regressive tax. Maybe this is a bit vulgar, but let's talk about cigarettes. So, the vast majority of the cost of a pack of cigarettes is actually tax. It's considered a vice, and therefore there's a vice tax on it, and I don't know, 80% or 90% of the cost of a pack of cigarettes in California is taxation, and the state of California uses a lot of that for anti-smoking campaigns and also for healthcare for people who are suffering from diseases caused by cigarette smoking. So in a sense, when they did studies of cigarettes and they found a link to chronic lung disease and chronic obstructive pulmonary conditions, COPV, I forget what the V stands for, sorry, but also heart disease. What government jurisdictions argued is that smoking causes diseases which are expensive to us to care for. Therefore, there is a nexus. There's a legal nexus for saying we can charge outrageously high taxes on cigarettes because they're costly to the entire society. And we have to cover emergency room visits and terminally ill people because of this. They also cause lost work. They cause increased sick days. They cause respiratory distress. So God save you. If you're a smoker right now, when COVID-19 is spreading around here and it's going to trigger SARS in you, there's a substantial reduction in your survival chances if you are a smoker. And even if you've only quit just recently, you have to have quit several years ago to have the sort of health rebound. So just FYI. But anyway, so the taxes are, let's say it's $5 per pack of cigarettes. Those of you who have smoked may know it's probably more than that now, but let's just say it's $5 per pack, and the pack only actually cost, I don't know, about 70 cents or less to produce a pack of cigarettes at this point. The thing is, whether you make $15,000 a year or $250,000 a year, if you're buying a pack of cigarettes, you pay the same sales tax. So for somebody who's making $250,000 a year as a computer programmer or whatever they do, a lawyer or ad executive or something like that, a banker, proportionally the amount that they're paying is tiny. So they can just keep on buying packs of cigarettes or whatever you want to look at that's heavily taxed. Maybe wine. Okay. For the person who's poor, proportionally, that's much more money. So even though the sales tax itself is the same on the product. And so you can call it a flat tax, meaning that it's the same taxation no matter who you are or what your income is. It's a flat tax on the product. Proportionally for the buyer, it's much, much higher if you're poor. So that's why it's considered regressive. Now, conservatives who've been arguing for cutting taxes have argued that we should have a flat tax on income as well, which means that let's say that it's 10%. So if you make $15,000 a year, 10% of that would be, $1,500 per year that you would pay as income tax. If you're making $250,000 a year, then flat tax on that will be $25,000. If you're making $1 billion a year, as some hedge fund managers do, then a flat tax on that would be $100 million. $100 million is a lot of money. And so even at a flat 10% tax rate, that would be a lot of money. And people that are arguing for a flat tax are saying, eliminate all loopholes and just have a 10% flat tax. The problem is we use loopholes, tax credits, and deductions basically to encourage people to do things we want to have happen in a society, like financing low-income housing. And we use increases on taxes for things that we want to discourage, like smoking. So, for instance, tax on cigarettes is very, very high. So that's a sales tax example, but in any case, I hope the point is clear. The problem is if you eliminate loopholes, what you eliminate is maybe half of the social programs that are done by the federal government today. Tax-deductible charitable donations, that's how charities survive. So if you eliminate them through doing a flat tax, then you're actually going to hurt almost every sort of nonprofit activity in the United States today. As it is right now, though, we have a progressive tax on income tax. What we don't have is a progressive income tax on capital gains. So actually for the super wealthy, from most of their income, which comes from stocks and other investments, they really do have a flat tax, and their flat tax is 15%. And that's why, and I had mentioned it a couple weeks ago, whether you and I have some investments which might pay out, we'd have a capital gains of 15%, but so does Warren Buffett, who's a multi-billionaire. And so we'd be paying 15%, so does Warren Buffett. So that's the reason why Warren Buffett's effective tax rate is 15%. And because he does charitable donations, it's a little bit less. It's maybe 14%. Mitt Romney, unlike our current president, Mitt Romney, very, very wealthy person, he did release his taxes. And what we found when we analyzed those was that his annual tax rate, his effective tax that he was paying was about 13.5% to 14%. Because it's mostly capital gains and then some deductions because he's donating to charity, which Mitt Romney does. He's a Mormon. They do that a lot. So there's a bunch of middle range earners who are earning $60,000 to $200,000 a year who are paying higher than that. They're paying up to 35%. And unless they donate a whole lot to charity, they're actually paying a higher tax rate than people who are poor and people who are extremely rich. So to bring this back around to thinking about land use planning and fiscalization, the reality is that the different sorts of sources of tax revenue have very different policies and they have very different profiles. Because of Prop 13, if we only all paid 1% property tax, then property owners will be benefiting from having a flat tax on their property. Just 1%. However, the longer you sit on the property, the more you profit from the fact that your assessment falls behind the actual value of that property. So it's not only regressive in the sense of being a flat tax on property, but it's also even hyper-regressive because the longer you hold on to that property, the more you're paying 0.9, 0.8, down to maybe 0.4% of your assessed value on your property. And if that property is worth $1 million, which is true of every single house in the East Bay and on the peninsula, many of which are worth much more than that, then you're a millionaire paying a very, very small fraction on property. So it's a highly regressive system we have here. But the other thing about income tax, sales tax, and property tax is that they rise and fall differently with booms and busts in an economy. So right now, we're not seeing a fall in property values in California, even though we have a major economic shock and we're all experiencing a big shock to our incomes. So income tax for 2020 has already taken a hit. Even just with this short period of isolation for people here in the Bay Area, it's a big shock. Sales tax, that's dropped off in a big way because people are at home. They're just buying food, but there's a lot of other things they're not buying. And so, the restaurant sector may just implode. Property tax is continuing on under its very, very distorted Prop 13 regime. But this economic shock is one example of how different types of tax revenue are impacted differently by economic change. And unfortunately, what we haven't done is try to align different types of tax revenue with a long-term economic development model. Some of them go up quickly and they go down quickly, depending upon what we're all experiencing, for instance, right now. But we haven't designed our tax revenue system to fit with a policy of long-term economic growth. And partly we haven't because, and as Fulton Shigley pointed out at the beginning of the chapter, up to this point, California's gotten away with massive economic development. So it's been sort of a windfall situation. We haven't had cities fighting desperately over trying to attract automakers. In fact, one of the most lucrative automakers just decided to set up shop in Fremont anyway. And you don't hear Californians freaking out about Tesla setting up its gigafactories for battery production out in Reno. We're not so worried about that. It's like, oh, great, we've even got an auto manufacturer in Fremont, and they'll set up some branch factories in other places. But yeah, they're still doing that. And I believe SpaceX is still building their rocket engines down in Los Angeles, and they may even build parts of their rocket hulls down there. Yeah, we still have a lot of basic industries, a lot of manufacturing in Metro Los Angeles. We have a huge amount of distribution in LA and in the Central Valley. And we still have the tech sector headquartered here in the Bay Area. So, yeah, it's still a bit lopsided. And so we're still a little under concerned about economic development. Okay. So let me get back to fiscalization of land use and talk about that. Because different taxes have different profiles, the one way we've started to do local jurisdiction land use planning that does respond to these differences in revenue profiles is that cities have been trying to attract businesses and not trying to attract housing. Sorry, Thomas, let me just check your post here. Why do we set aside certain taxes for funding specific government processes? Why isn't all the different taxes pulled together and divided in percentages? Oh, okay, so that's good to know. We don't do it because taxation is overtly, it's a political process. Nobody likes paying a lot of tax. That's always been true. It turns out taxes are not unavoidable. Death is unavoidable, but taxes are not. When I was working in Afghanistan in 2003, they didn't have any tax revenue system in place, so they were just relying on the U.S. to send billions of dollars to their government in order to prop up their government, and they didn't have to tax their people. Taxing requires a lot of paperwork. It requires a lot of monitoring. You've got to be able to, document where all the properties are, document where all the people are. You have to track a bunch of information. So you can imagine a post-war Afghanistan doesn't have that, and so that hurts their government revenue. But here's the really downside to that. If a government doesn't do all of that bargaining with its people and persuading its people they should pay taxes, then the government also feels like it doesn't owe anything to the people. So you want a government that has to do all that hard bargaining with the population that's always grumbling about paying its taxes. And so the government has to show that it is delivering on the goods. And so governments will often earmark specific parts of the budget for specific programs. And they'll do that because they'll say, look, this is your tax dollars at work. Literally. You'll see that, like, Senate Bill 1 was a multi-billion-dollar bond measure that funded repair and reconstruction of highways that were getting pretty ratty here in California. So I don't know if you've seen it if you drive around on some of the highways in California, but there's still billboards up that say, this highway restoration or this lane widening or whatever it is funded by Senate Bill 1, SB 1. Your tax dollars at work, yeah. And so you now have this process of governments kind of advertising or at least self-advocating for how they're spending your money. And frankly, that's probably what they should be doing. They're trying to sell their services and say, yeah, give us money for this, and here's what we're delivering to you. So, right. Oh, so I thought I was asking about. So I'm hoping, Thomas, that explains why often with bonds or with initiative measures, we do earmark the funds. And in local government, that can even happen where they'll earmark funds and say a certain amount of this doesn't go into the general fund. It's earmarked for this, and we're doing that because we know that a lot of people are pretty crabby about paying any more taxes. So we promise this money only goes to this particular function. So that's why earmarking happens for tax revenue that goes into particular things. So Ivana, you're asking, why is it the tax revenue system has not been designed for long-term economic growth? I'm not sure if I understood that concept correctly. Okay, so the reason why we didn't design our tax system for long-term economic growth is that the tax system that we have in place now came about piecemeal over time. The United States started only with import-export taxes, known as customs revenues, and there was a controversy around those, known as the Stamp Act. I think it was 1764, and that irritated a lot of colonists, and that's why they refused to buy the tea that had been priced much higher because of the Stamp Act, which was a customs duty, a customs tax on the tea, and that's why they dumped the tea in the harbor. That was the Boston Tea Party. And they were particularly irritated because they had not been consulted in that particular tax increase. So when people talk about the Tea Party and they talk about the Boston Tea Party and also the conservative anti-tax Tea Party of the 21st century, there is a long history of Americans being crabby about taxes. Anyway, after customs taxes, which were easy to collect because you could see goods coming into and out of the country, the next sort of tax that we put in place was property tax. And that was easy because it's easy to document property. It can't run away and hide in the woods. It's there. You can document it. And so tax assessors would assess property, and that was organized at the county level, certainly in California from the beginning of the state of California in 1850. Property taxes has been at the county level. The tax assessor is the one that does that. And that's the reason why, by the way, for GIS purposes, if you want to get your GIS file of all of the properties in your particular area, even if your area is, say, Walnut Creek or Berkeley, you might need to go to the county level, like Alameda County, to get the property tax assessor's office GIS model of your city. So, for San Francisco, it's one city, one county combined. For San Mateo, though, you have to go to the San Mateo County website in order to get the GIS data of the assessor's parcel. And that's the GIS map of parcels is going to be from the assessor's office because it is worthwhile for them to go through all the hassle of maintaining a GIS model of your property records because they're the ones that collect revenue, right? So the people that are actually getting the money, the revenue from it, they're the ones that update the records. So there's a policy logic thing you should just all know. So property was easy to track. After that, I believe sales tax came in. shoot, I don't know the history, but sales tax I think is late 19th century. Income tax came in last. Income tax came in with a constitutional amendment in 1913 under Teddy Roosevelt. And it was because there was extreme inequality that started in the late 19th century. And so income tax came in to level out that inequality because the robber barons who owned the railroads had a huge amount of income. And so people wanted to level the playing field a bit. And so income tax came in. I think the top tax rate initially was about 28%, but fairly quickly, and certainly by, under Roosevelt in 1932, the top tax rate became 70%. So the wealthiest people would pay 70% of their income, annual income, as income tax. But what that meant was that customs taxes came into the federal government, but it wasn't that much. Property tax came in a lot, but it came into local governments, and they used it to fund schools. Sales tax, so local government at the county level, but then when they would incorporate, the property tax would go to the city level, at least for California. And I think that's generally was the rule across most states. I should check that. Sales tax came in at the county level and tended to be retained by counties. And so that's still true in California. You've got a county sales tax. And there may be a state sales tax as well on top of that. Depends on where you are. On the Pacific Coast, there's a lot of variation. I believe Oregon has no state sales tax, and Washington State has quite a high state sales tax. Somebody Google that and check for me on that. California is sort of between the two. So you have some state sales tax and some county sales tax, which means if you're in Alameda County versus San Francisco versus Marin, you're paying slightly different sales tax on goods. In any case, each of these forms of taxation came in with a change in our ability to monitor things, and also a change in sort of political mood. So income tax came in last in a period of extreme economic inequality at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, income tax is the vast majority of revenue for the federal government. So what that then meant was, after 1913, you had income tax, and it went up to 70%, and stayed there for a long time. For about 7 years under Eisenhower in the 1950s, the top tax rate went up to 91%, and also the proportional scale for all of them was a little bit higher below that. The reason Eisenhower did that is because he was a Republican of the 1950s variety, and Republicans at that point were fiscal conservatives, and they said, we need to actually reduce the debt. We spent a lot of money on World War II. We need to lower the wartime debt, so we need to pay it down so that the federal government isn't paying a whole bunch of interest on debt servicing for bonds. Because bonds are basically a loan by the government. It's read up on it. I'm going to keep on moving ahead here. But you can look it on various different websites. What is a bond? So he set the top tax rate up at 91%, and then once the war debt had been paid down enough, it went back down to 70% through the 1960s and the 1970s, and then under Reagan's tax reforms in 1986, it went from 70% down to 35%, and then I believe under George W. Bush in 2005, I think the top income tax rate is lower. I think the top rate is either 28 or 32% right now. But all of this came in haphazardly with different geographies of politics of income tax versus sales tax versus property tax, and so here's the big takeaway from that. A lot of central policy for any governmental level is done in a haphazard way over time. The notion that governments pre-plan all of this stuff and they know better and they're all organized is just not the case. In practice, when you look at how governments do things, it has a real improvisational quality and a real sort of reacting after the fact quality. Or to put it in more vulgar terms, the sort of, oh shit, what do we do about this? Or, oh wow, we figured this new thing out, let's use this. But it doesn't have so much of a quality of, oh, we've carefully thought this through ahead of time and we're all organized about this. So just so you know, if you want to look at the history of institutions kind of gelling and pulling together over time, A lot of it is improv. And that's one reason why when you look at people who are doing conspiracy theories and saying, oh, they knew all about this. Oh, they all thought about this all ahead of time. News for you. If you're going to work in any public agency, you should just know people are winging it all the time. A good example of that is we now have a fiscally conservative president, tax-cutting president, who is thinking about giving $1,000 to every household or every taxpayer in the country. Like, how the hell are they going to afford that without a tax increase? They're winging it. This is improv. But it's not just the present administration, and this has been true of presidencies going all the way back to the beginning. And it's been true of local governments as well. They just kind of wing it. Oh, there's Jeffrey, who has worked in San Francisco government, and he's laughing. Yeah. It's a very, very important lesson to learn. So if you're going to work in the public sector, or you're going to work with the public sector, let's say you work in a nonprofit, just keep in mind, they're like you, and they're like, oh shit, what do we do now? Right? Here we have this COVID virus. Like, oh shit, what do we do now? And now we've got Metro Bay Area doing a quarantine. Right? Shelter in place. Oh shit, what do we do now? Sort of winging it. We'll see. It's a massive sort of experiment in epidemiology and public health policy. Maybe we're going to do better than we have in the past with these things. That's going to be awesome if so. The economic impacts are going to be disastrous, so we have a massive amount of damage control to do. And public officials who want to get reelected are thinking, how am I not going to get politically slaughtered by this whole process? And how much do I have to say to people, oh, it's all fine, I'll be comfortable? And how much do I have to say, that's going to bite me in the ass, or economic implosion is going to bite me in the ass? Which is going to be worse? And they're kind of improvising. And no matter whether you're sympathetic or not sympathetic to this particular administration, it's fair to say any administration would do this. So, okay. Back to fiscalization. So, sales tax was not regulated by Prop 13, so a lot of local jurisdictions started trying to get retail sales in there. And so for a good 20 years, if you were going to be teaching California land use planning, you'd be talking about the fiscalization of land use planning under Prop 13. However, as Fulton and Shigley point out, that has changed. Why has it changed? Sound off. So if fiscalization means, well, as land use planners, we don't want to have so many houses in there because residents require expensive operating services, high operating expenses for education and police and water and sewerage and all that. We'd rather have shops. We'd rather have big box retail and collect their sales tax revenue, because that doesn't put the same sort of financial burden on us. Okay, so why has that changed in the last 10 years? Oh, see, I can touch my nose because I'm at home. Yes. But now I'll have to wash my hands later after this video. Sound off. Why has it changed now? Why is this? Okay, so the housing crisis, unfortunately, the housing crisis has not really changed that. So I know that a number of Bay Area cities are saying we have to deal with the homelessness crisis and we've got to put more housing in, but it's still going to be expensive. So the housing crisis is not pushing, is not an incentive, not a positive incentive towards changing the revenue model. What else has changed recently? Here's a hint. Think about how our format of our class has changed. Here we are on the web. How about that change finance for a city? What's the hint? If you think about sales tax revenue, yes, there is a change in economic demand, but let's say, so you're the city of San Francisco. You've got 12,000 restaurants, but you also have a bunch of other retail. People are buying stuff in shops, and the shops are charging sales tax for point-of-sale purchases, right? And by the way, some of the exemptions are groceries and basic clothing. Those don't actually have sales tax on them, and that was put in place because whether you're rich or poor, you have to get basic food and you have to get clothing, and so they decided to exempt those. But why else? What else has changed? No, coronavirus? Nope. That's no. Something over the last 10 years has changed. Yes, retail is going online more now. So if people are buying more and more on the internet, you might have to pay state sales tax, but you're not paying retail sales tax at point of sale inside your own city. Yeah, so Annie's got it. Yes, growth of e-commerce, right. So what this means now is that the fiscalization of land use that we've seen over the last 20 years is now changing again because local jurisdictions they may try to attract retail, but we're not going to be seeing a whole lot of growth in retail. And in fact, when you're looking at the coronavirus pandemic right now, what you may see is restaurants are in free fall. Like, what are they doing? Coffee shops and restaurants, which was a big growth sector for the last 20 years, particularly coffee shops, right? Your Wi-Fi cafes, high revenue, just making coffee and providing internet, and people pay ridiculous amounts for coffee, right? That is in suspended animation right now, right? So sales tax revenue just dropped off a cliff. So now we're going to have to rethink that once again. But that trend has been downward for some time, that you have fewer and fewer people buying locally. And what that has also meant is that there is a general principle in land use planning that you should know, which is that there used to be a ratio of how much retail space you needed per given population. So if you have 1,000 people living in an area, you used to need X number, 100 square feet of retail. And you could look it up in books like, oh gosh, I remember what it looks like, but I can't remember its name. It doesn't matter because it's no longer relevant. But what has happened is, because of increasing online sales, and particularly because we had the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, retail never really recovered. And we don't actually know what the ratio was as of February 2020 between 1,000 people and how much square footage of retail is really supported. Right now, it's much, much lower, but it may return later this year to what it was in February 2020. And that wasn't that high. So now we have a housing crisis. We also have a whole bunch of closed storefronts. So we'll probably start figuring out how to put housing into retail space. And a lot of cities have been fighting that because they've been saying, look, we need to keep those retail spaces open because we need to have local business development. We need that for local tax revenue. But at this point, any sort of rule of thumb that we used to have, any sort of formula that we used to have of what the ratio is between X number of square feet of retail given a particular resident population, that's just been thrown out the window. It was kind of leaving out the window over the last 10 years, but now it's left the building. We don't know what that ratio is and what's going to come back after this quarantine ends. So what Fulton and Shigley don't talk about, which is an urban economics process you should all know about in general, so it's outside of the scope of their book, but this is something else that's going to come back in, is what we call the marginal propensity to spend. So I'm going to type that up there so that I'll have it. Marginal propensity to spend. So let's say that you're an employee at some company. You have your revenue. You live wherever you live in the Bay Area. You still have to pay for basic services, whatever it is. If it's PG&E for your electrical, so your utilities, and wherever you shop locally, at least for food. You may be shopping online for other things. Personal electronics. Maybe you're buying that online, whatever. But a lot of stuff you are actually buying locally. So out of every dollar that you earn, there's a certain amount that you're going to spend locally, and a certain amount that you're going to spend remotely. And that ratio has been shifting over time, but that ratio is called the marginal propensity to spend, particularly to spend locally. So urban economists have looked at how much do people spend locally on goods and services. And the result of this marginal propensity to spend locally is that if you have revenue coming into a business, and that revenue comes from anywhere outside, let's say that you work, let's say you're a tech worker, let's say you work at Apple. You're receiving a salary, some of which you spend far away, travel or online purchases, whatever. They're remote, right? They're not local expenditures. But you're spending on things like your house, but also on food and all these various different goods and services that are local. As you spend locally, you support local employment. So previously, the rule of thumb was that for any sort of business that's bringing in revenue from the outside, each employee in that business generates about 5 local jobs. So the local stuff would be, working in a restaurant or working in retail someplace. That's sort of a local circulation. It's not generating revenue from the outside that's being brought into the region, but it is part of the circular economy within that area. So an industrial sector or economic sector that brings in revenue from outside of that metropolis is bringing in revenue to the city, but then you have a lot of internal circulation, and the rough ratio is about 5 to 1 of jobs created for revenue being brought in from the outside. So the Bay Area is still blessed with things like Tesla and the Silicon Valley tech sector, because that's a huge amount of revenue coming in from worldwide, and then it's spent to some degree locally. Paige is asking about e-commerce and less cars. Yeah, so e-commerce is likely to facilitate less cars. Yeah, and there is some debate about portions of delivery fees being paid as city tax versus state tax. Yeah, so in general, this gets back to what I had mentioned earlier on, which is that you do have a lot of jurisdictional transfer of revenue. And yeah, I think what we're going to see as a discussion at the state level is that local retail is probably going to continue to decline. And now when you buy something on Amazon, you do have to pay the state sale tax, I believe, of where your purchasing is, right? It's because we're purchasing in California, so you have to pay California sales tax. Gosh, I should know that. I'm pretty certain that's the case. But for almost 10 years, we didn't pay tax. If we're purchasing something that was from out of state, we weren't paying tax for years on a lot of internet purchases. In some ways, you can think of that as a tax holiday that enabled e-commerce to take off, and a lot of government agents wanted the growth of e-commerce because it was an economic growth sector. But now we are paying state sales tax. So yeah, I think that either it would make sense to do the transfers between the state of California and local jurisdictions to keep on funding things at the local level from the state sales tax revenue, or we could change to having e-commerce actually charge taxes locally. So your internet service provider can find your IP address, find out what jurisdiction that is, and then you pay the local sales tax on your online purchase. It could go in that direction. I haven't heard the tendency to do that. You can do a little bit of workaround if you use a VPN and you therefore purchase something from someplace remote, but you're going to run the risk of getting dinged, because if your purchase address, like the credit card address and your delivery address are both, say, in Alameda County, and you've purchased it from a very low tax state, let's say Idaho or maybe Oregon, right? Then you might get nailed for tax fraud. That could be bad. So yeah, we might be able to work it that way. Okay. So we're about at 12:15. We're about to wrap up. So let me see here. I didn't talk so much about redevelopment. Take a look at the end of the chapter, thinking about tax increment financing. We've talked a lot about the link between the economy and planning. You know, how to use revenue to fund, you know, places that are distressed and underfunded. That's hard, especially when you've got revenue really truncated by things like Prop 13 and by the change of where sales tax is collected. But in any case, we've got plenty of food for thought. So I will actually reconvene here online and hopefully with a hell of a lot more bandwidth on Friday at 11, and we can talk about GIS. But this is, yeah, this is supposed to be the last lecture before spring break. Yeah, I'm wondering if we should have a collective discussion about that. Do you want to have a spring break, or do you want to just kind of plow ahead? It's a little bit weird to have a spring break where you're stuck at home. And if you're starting to go stir crazy, maybe you want to talk about planning. I don't know. But if you do, this might be a good opportunity to just keep education going, even in this slightly surreal state. Yeah, and again, if some of you are using Zoom for other classes, let me know if there's some specific advantages you've seen to that. I am open to that. I mean, here I've got this system up and running now, so okay, that's good. But again, if you find something compelling that's actually superior about using Zoom, let me know. And with that, I'm going to sign off. I will see some of you on Friday. That's on a strictly volunteer basis, but we'll take a look at GIS then. All right, you take care.